What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and I'm really excited to be joined by my co-host, Nikki Glasser. Nikki, welcome to Madness Radio.
Thank you, Will. Glad to be here.
I really appreciate your work as show co-producer and co-host. Do you want to introduce our guest today, Michael Montgomery?
Yeah, absolutely. He has a talk on YouTube called Tales of Treatment, Hope Without Borders, and I watched it recently. I just was so deeply moved by what he had to say, and I'm really excited that we have Michael on the show today, and I want to hear more. Michael Montgomery is an existential psychoanalyst working in a clinic specializing in psychosis and complex trauma. He works in the tradition of R.D. Laing using non-pathologizing approach. Welcome to Madness Radio, Michael Montgomery.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for that introduction. It's very exciting to be here. Absolute pleasure to spend some time with both you and Will.
Yeah, Michael, it was my great honor to meet you at the recent R.D. Laing symposium at Esalen last year. And we were all really, really struck by you're not an ordinary, standard, mainstream professional. And I think that is really going to inspire our listeners to meet you and hear about how your work is different. And maybe we should just get started. How did you get interested in being a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, working in mental health? Did you start out more mainstream and then move to a different perspective? How did that happen for you?
It was a parallel journey, if you like. I had my first sort of career in business. I kind of worked my way up with more or less no qualifications. I left school at 16. I had an undiagnosed dyslexia. And then I felt the need to sort of find answers about the meaning of life. And that really came about because I grew up in Northern Ireland during the armed conflict. So, if you like, I was met with the existential realities of death and impermanence and sought the answers to that. And to cut a very long story short, I ended up going and living in a Buddhist retreat center for several years.
For people who don't know about Northern Ireland and the war and conflict there, tell us a little bit about that and how that kind of brought you to the thinking that led to going into a Buddhist retreat training.
Well, I mean, I have a memory of being 7 years old and thinking, what is the point? Because I was sort of surrounded by daily shootings and bombings. And I thought, I'm just going to grow old and kind of die myself. You know, a standard therapist might try and pathologize that kid, but I think that kid was very much aware of their existence. And the reason I know it was 1977 and I was 7 years of age was because it was the year that Star Wars came out. My world turned from black and white to sort of color. My imagination spiked, but also it communicated the hero's journey, being called to adventure. And there was something in that for me. So fast forward, you know, working through all the different sort of traditions to try and find some sort of knowledge that would make sense of this. I ended up in Buddhism because it seemed to be the most spiritually vibrant practice that I could come across. There seemed to be real things happening and real wisdom. So I did the classic going forth and went and lived and studied and practiced meditation very intensely. But at the end of that journey, I kind of got the answers that I was looking for in terms of meaning. And I wanted to dedicate myself to others to sort of making a difference in the world.
You got the answers to what is the meaning of life. Can you please share what were the answers that you got in terms of meaning?
Uh,
Or is it going to take years of meditation? We just have to find it.
Well, I think the cutting through of the suffering that I guess I was witnessing and experiencing was understanding the nature of mind. There's not much more to say or that I can say about that, but I would say there's very much a tradition, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism and in Dzogchen and Mahamudra in particular, of an exploration of the nature of mind. And then the answers kind of come from that.
And so it inspired you to help others. Is that what got you interested in working in the mental health field?
So there's a parallel story. So the mental health field, I'd always been deeply interested in it because I had a friend. So I was at a party. I'm from the original rave generation clubbing. And so I was at a party and it was about 3 in the morning. And there was this quite unusual character who's a lot older. And he told me his story. And it was basically about geometry and Zeus and how the 45-degree angle was measured wrong and just all this fantastic stories. It was so beautiful. And this was like for a few hours. And at the end of this sort of encounter, he told me that he had been incarcerated against his will for 3 months. And that was kind of shocking for me because I didn't really know much about this world. And then he told me something that really changed kind of the course of my life.
He had been in a psychiatric institute.
Yeah, he's been in a psychiatric institute. And he told me that in the 3 months he was in there, nobody had asked him his story. And I just couldn't believe it because I saw this beautiful being as a storyteller, as a Shanachie, as it's called in Ireland. And I couldn't understand why that was the result of the world that he inhabited. It just seemed so draconian and so dehumanizing. And that sent me on a path to understand two things. One, the mind and how his experience was so incredibly different to mine. And also, I mean, what was going on with the care system. So even when I was in business, I started volunteering and I was doing an organization called Praxis that did mentoring, where you just went and met someone and took them out for a meal, or you took them shopping, or you just spent time with them. And it was people who had spent time in hospital. So it was like a partnering up. And so you didn't need to have any formal training. It was just being with people.
Beautiful.
From there, I just sort of kept going. So after I came out of the Buddhist Retreat Center, I went to university for the first time, or college, as you like to call it. And I did social work. I was in community mental health. I was just completely shocked with how people were being treated. It was just the most brutal, negating, sort of shocking experience. And often, this was in London, often people from disadvantaged areas, minority, I don't even know that's the right word it was then, communities, people who were just trying to get by and didn't quite fit in and were being medicated beyond reason. There were things like community treatment orders where if they didn't take the medication, often by depot injection, they would have to go back into hospital. And it just seemed totally unsatisfactory. And I wanted to know more and I wanted to do more. And I thought the best way to do that was to keep training clinically. But my partner, we got married and very quickly moved to Asia. So I ended up living in Asia, UK, Germany, Chicago. So I had a lot of experience in different cultures and really observing presentations without that Western overlay. So a much more phenomenological experience of distress and suffering.
Yeah, it's interesting because you started out kind of from the outside and then made your way in. You were studying mind, but you had this strong encounter with the guy with the geometry at the rave. And then you were doing just really, it sounds like peer support, the mentoring that you were doing. And you sort of learned common sense ways to connect. And then that was contrasted by when you got exposed to the community mental health system. And so you didn't start out already believing in the mental health system. You really had an outside perspective, it sounds like.
I didn't see, I didn't experience people as being different from me. So I couldn't understand why they were treated so badly. I mean, I don't think it was even called peer support then. It was just get people out and spend time with them. And that was seen as very therapeutic. I mean, I spent a year, probably a year and a half with a guy, and I didn't ever ask him what was their diagnosis, or I just tried to meet what he needed from me, which was driving and, taking them places. And
This was called mentoring. This is the volunteering that you did.
the organization was called Praxis. So I think it came out of Queen's University in Belfast, where they worked out that this sort of support was really, really beneficial for people who had come out of hospital. I mean, we're going back about 25 years. So yeah, I think that the phrase I used in Esalen was virgin eyes. So yeah, absolutely coming at it with no sort of preconception, but I felt I was quite streetwise and quite assertive. So my experience on the wards and the ward rounds, when I first was in that environment, I observed how everyone but the psychiatrist would be excluded through language. So they had their own lingo and their own jargon. So I went home and I purchased the Oxford Dictionary of Psychiatry and I read it over a weekend. And I went in on the next ward round. And I remember 2 weeks from that point, I was the first to be called on the ward round, even before the other psychiatrists, because I was able to match my knowledge with their lingo. So I was no longer excluded. That was the other thing that was really shocking. So I believe it's similar here, but what used to happen was the patient would have to come into these rooms, and in the room, you would have maybe 15 or 20 people. So you'd have like a handful of psychiatrists, you'd have trainee occupational therapists, social workers, interns, and they had to sort of shuffle in. And then they were like asked these really invasive questions. And that was the first sort of point where I thought, right, I'm going to definitely do something here. And I really took a stand. So there were things that I was observing, like someone would be asked questions and they would be deemed incoherent. And I immediately was able to say, the person is hilarious, intelligent, and on point. They're one question behind because they're so heavily medicated. So they're not really listening. They're listening for pathology. They're not listening for the human. So if I answered you one question or one answer behind your question, I'm out of sync. So it does sound incoherent, but it was anything but. And also, people, they would be upset the way they were treated. So then they would respond and then oh, this patient's aggressive. Yeah, he's the one black man in a room with 15 white people who are making decisions about his liberty. Of course he's going to be upset. I don't know how much good that did, but my favorite one that I did was I got so fed up with this dehumanization. I knew one of the women on the ward was a beautiful singer. So I got a copy of her CD, which was a demo CD, and I went into the wardrobe and I said, listen, I want you to indulge me. And I put a sort of beatbox in the middle of the floor and I put on her demo, and it was the Look of Love. She sang, it was like angelic, this voice. And everyone's looking at me. And then I said, this is the person that you're going to see next. And, she sort of shuffled in, totally medicated. And I don't know whether it did any good or not, but it made me communicate, there needs to be humanity here. You need to see this as a person and not just somebody to be labeled and diagnosed. So it was a very hands-on experience.
You said a phenomenological view. How does that fit in? Because it sounds abstract, but it's actually essentially a kind of a common sense paying attention to what people are noticing and experiencing.
Yeah, so my own journey would have been what's wrong with the person. And then that moved to when I started to understand trauma, what has happened to this person, to the phenomenological approach, which was, what is this like for you? What is this experience? So if someone was talking about things that I perhaps didn't understand, rather than question that against my own view of the world, I want to know what it's like for them to have that experience. So I think, there's a long history of philosophy about phenomenology. I wish there was an easier word and a shorter word, but basically it means to tune into someone's lived experience and to move as much of your experience and presuppositions out of the way so you can really see and understand what is happening.
I just want to chime in because I already feel emotional from what you're saying. And I just want to point out that what you're saying and what you're seeing in the system it's so special to hear somebody who hasn't been incarcerated themselves or oppressed by the system to see what is really going on there. And this is why your talk on YouTube like moved me so much. And also, you just come from a really caring, heartfelt place on top of it. So I see it now. I see what's going on there now, believe me. But back then, I didn't, and I grew up in an abusive home. And so when they told me this is just how it is, and this is how, I thought, oh, okay. But really, it was just reenacting a lot of really harsh, unloving, uncaring behavior that I was already ailing from. You know what I mean? Suffering from having grown up. So it was like kind of a re-traumatization. So my question for you is like, it just amazes me, and it's so beautiful that you see it. Like, how is that? I don't know if there's an answer to that. Maybe it's just rhetorical, but you see so clearly the humanity of people, but it also like how other people are not seeing people's humanity, like they're missing the whole person. And so it's just really special. I don't know if that's a question that can be answered, or maybe the answer or the question is, do you see other people working in your type of capacity as a helper, therapist, doctor, nurse, who are seeing it?
So it's really, really good questions. I think it seemed really obvious to me that injecting people with medication that they don't want to take can't be good. It must be frightening. Surely it's obvious that when someone is in a state of distress, what they need is safety, right? Being dragged around and forced around and made to do that is not my idea of how to treat somebody. To me, it seemed very obvious. It wasn't obvious to anyone else because I went through this period of absolute despair. Like, is this me? Is this me? Am I losing it here? Is this what is happening or am I completely wrong? And that's where Artie Lang came in. That's when I picked up Artie Lang and it was like, oh my goodness. He gave me the support to understand that no, it wasn't just me. The first thing was that I saw and I believed that was absolutely obvious. These are not the side effects of these medications. These are the effects of the medication. So I was seeing people put on weight in record time. So they went into hospital with one problem and then they came out with a whole range of other problems. And, you know, I saw people disfigured. That would be the best way to describe it, from the impact on the medication. And then what I experienced was a justification for this from psychiatry that just was really weak. It's, oh, the person isn't exercising or this or that and jumping around a little bit. In Malaysia, I had more of an opportunity to help people come off medication. And I witnessed the impact of polypharmacy. And I witnessed the impact when people came off, when it was appropriate to do so, right?
You were practicing as a therapist in Malaysia.
Yeah, I was sort of in a community setting. So I kind of watched the effects of the medication go away, the negative effects. Psychiatrists would call it side effects. So I was getting sort of hands on experience in observation. But in London, it was just obvious. But here's the problem, Nikki, and I hope this doesn't upset you. I see a lot of very, very kind people working in mental health, but are still not thinking. They've completely sort of drank the Kool-Aid in terms of psychiatry, the medical model, because that's the way they were trained, and there is no critical capacity. So I remember being in a large clinical meeting in America, and I said, "Can I just ask first of all, the psychiatrists weren't coming to the meeting." And I said, "Why are the psychiatrists not coming to the meeting?" And often they're not psychiatrists anymore, they're nurses. So I said, surely the job of this clinic is to ensure that if people are on medication, that we work towards getting them to the minimum amount or the zero amount. when I said that out loud, I felt like I had a tinfoil hat on my head. That's how out of step. So I think people can be kind and not thinking critically. I think people can be kind and not think that actually advocating for a review of medication, especially polypharmacy, is an ethical thing to do. So I think it's a complex situation. And I think a lot of it's to do with the training and what people are told. So that was where Artie Lang gave me the support, gave me the language.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial question. I mean, you said drank the Kool-Aid and that's how they're trained. And I think in some ways there's a real dark shadow to what it is to be human, that we are able to just ignore what's obvious in front of our very eyes because we're caught up in some kind of institution of authority teaching us that what we see with our eyes isn't actually what we see. I mean, do you think that that's fundamentally what is happening, that it's an authority kind of almost like cult indoctrination?
In Malaysia, I had an aha moment. And the aha moment was this isn't as dark as I thought. This is just about money. So I watched how the big pharma capitalized the channels of information on the ground and how, for example, it was targeting children, premorbid schizophrenia. It was pushing the medication. They were advising one organization to put the medication in the client's food without their knowledge. When I questioned one of the managers around this, they said, this is what the pharmaceutical companies told us to do. So I had this aha moment, which was actually, it's a new market. So if you swap out humanity, if this was just Viagra, for instance, right? You want to monopolize a market before your competition, you want to grow it. So if you step back like that, if you look at the opioid crisis and, the documentaries on that, you got salespeople driving the growth, right? They are brainwashed to believe that they are doing good. They are reducing pain. They are curing, so I think it was less dark and more connected to money and profit. I think in America and the UK, the area that I got very interested in was the McDonaldization of society. So this comes from the work of George Ritzer, who was a sociologist and mentor of mine, Donna Dustin, and also my work. And it was basically the idea that the approach of the fast food industry is ubiquitous in society. So predictability, control, measurability. And if you look at a computer system, what needs input, the clinicians look at the human in a way that can be input into a computer. That's not the way it was meant to be. But if you think about it, that's what ultimately happens. There becomes a tick box mentality. What if there isn't a tick box for what is going on? So I thought Ritzer's work was really, really useful because there's a lot of irrational consequences of McDonaldization. So it might seem very efficient and very good, but it's de-skilling, it's dehumanizing.
So part of it is just this kind of let's do what we're told by the people above us. But part of it is the infiltration of this economic logic, the fast food product consumerism, which is all about speed and uniformity. And I mean, the DSM is basically like labeling so that when people come down the assembly line, you can just slap a label on them like they're a product and then funnel them into whatever different shoot for the different kinds of technology services that you're going to deploy on them. So it has that element of like habit and efficiency and productivity logic that's throughout capitalist society in general.
So it's perfect for McDonaldization, the DSM, for all the reasons that you just said. But what it does offer is certainty. People are drawn for easy, quick answers, right? So it offers a level of certainty for people. I think the DSM on diagnosis in general would be much more focused in the UK than America. It's much broader.
How do you mean it's different in the UK?
I think it takes a lot more work and focus to get a diagnosis because the seriousness of the diagnosis is huge. And also you don't have the insurance system. So it'll be the National Health Service, whereas here you can't see someone without a diagnosis. So most clinicians, if they're unsure and they're good, they'll just put something like general anxiety. They'll have a catch-all
Yeah, adjustment disorder. Yeah.
adjustment disorder, and also it you could easily change a diagnosis here, whereas in the UK it's like like fixed for life. Such was the power of psychiatry. It fitted into this class system. Often the doctors were more middle class, educated, so there was a sort of social hierarchy to psychiatry. I don't experience that in the same way in America.
Interesting. I mean, we had a revolution against monarchy, and you guys didn't quite have that. So that might be some of the difference. Also, what you said about control, because I think that what happens with madness, it's like a encounter, an existential encounter with the absolute limit of what it seems to be human, like dying. It's like a death encounter. Madness is the great, huge fear, and it's completely out of control and completely unreachable from a certain perspective. And so, from that out of control, overwhelm, unreachable position, someone feels absolutely out of control and they're desperate to know what to say, to know what to do, to know how to help, to do the right thing. And then that's when the conformity comes in. Okay, here, this is this person in the community. No one knows what to do with them. It's hard to communicate with them. They seem like they're in danger, but we're not even sure. Everyone is afraid. Things are out of control. And then here comes psychiatry, steps into that kind of existential need, and then falsely covers it over with this ideology and this belief system that's based on control and suppression and domination and authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I think just the whole medical model is problematic. You know, a broken arm is not the same as a broken spirit, but the psychiatrist will try and treat it in the same way. I have found people to be very kind and very knowledgeable, but completely wedded to medication. You know what horrified me? The quickest way to get on more medication in America is to ask to come off your medication.
Right. Right.
I mean, well, what is that? What is that? I've had experiences where I've gone on leave. I've been helping somebody to taper off medication and I've gone on leave and I've come back and they've been given a couple of new medications and they're bouncing off the walls. And I honestly don't see the people doing that as trying to control. I see them as doing what they think is the right thing.
Or they are afraid of losing control of being able to help, that feeling of helplessness or doing the right thing or
Yeah, well, how do you help someone in 15 minutes? Isn't that the average time that a prescriber will see somebody? I mean, I've worked in clinics where 1 year of therapy was a hello, was an introduction.
I have a question. Do you ever think that the system is more sick than the people seeking help?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, where's the love? I think that there's a conflict of interest, isn't there? That's a huge problem. In aspects of the prison system, in aspects of medicine, there's a conflict of interest in terms of why things are happening, who profits.
In a way, I've always thought that the psychologists kind of have a real potential edge because they're not getting sort of the Kool-Aid brainwashing of the medical system as much. They're doing more like going inside people and what's going on inside people. Not that everybody gets there, but I think they're just generally more hopeful as professionals as seeing what's true.
so Michael, you said that encountering the work of R.D. Laing really made a huge difference because you felt that your observation of what felt obvious was now confirmed by reading Laing. So how tell us a little bit about Laing and you in your bio we learned that you're a existential psychoanalyst. So how does that fit together with your Buddhism? I don't tend to think of existentialism and Buddhism as related, but I guess they are.
Yeah, I mean, the existential psychoanalysis, it sounds very grand, but I'll be probably, full disclosure, I'll do whatever I need to do to help somebody. So I like that title. I've earned that title over many, many years, but I do work integratively. So it's not about my theory or way of working. It's about what the person needs. But yeah, I mean, very much in the tradition of R.D. Laing. I think he drew from the rich philosophy of continental existentialism. So a bunch of men and women who were really affected by the trauma of the Second World War. And this is the more contemporary existentialists. And we're looking for some sort of answer in that meaninglessness and that carnage. So you'd Sartre, you'd Heidegger, Simone Beauvoir, Camus, who isn't normally thought of an existentialist, but I think for me, you really must include him. And Lang was also a psychiatrist and trained at the Tavistock. We share that in common. And he studied psychoanalysis. And I think he was quite disillusioned with aspects of psychoanalysis. Existentialism gave him more answers about the sort of existential lived experience of someone beyond some limiting frame of.
So there's a close connection between existentialism and phenomenology, but tell us, what is existentialism for people who aren't following that? In 5 words or less, please.
What does it mean to be? What does it mean to actually exist? I think it's a bit of a catch-all term, existentialism, to mean. I think it covers phenomenology. Lang would have been a social phenomenologist in the sense that he very much took into account the lived experience of the individual, but also had them in context. So was very aware of the, if you want to use the word oppression, and the limitations that society can place on a person. So it's not just the individual, it's the individual in context. And I think he was fascinated by key themes of dread, brokenheartedness, and fear, things that are much more human than perhaps the Oedipal complex, or things that are a little bit still have value, but maybe less accessible to the person on the street. So I think he was very much hands-on, very much empathetic. He didn't use the distance of a clinician or the professional distance. He would get on the floor with his patients. And I think that's a really important metaphor. There's inequality to that. Actually, we're both beings who are going to die. We have that in common. We're both looking into the existential givens. You just may be a little bit more distressed than I am right now.
Yeah, we're all motivated by the need for recognition and to be listened to and seen. We all struggle with connection and loneliness and isolation. And the thing I keep coming back to when I think of existentialism is the idea of choice, that everybody always has some capacity to make some kind of choice. We may not be able to control our circumstances. We certainly can be in overwhelming circumstances that are oppressive, and a lot of our choices have been taken away. But we still fundamentally have the choice of what kind of meaning that we bring to our experience. And I'm always looking for, both in myself, but also people that I'm working with or I want to listen to and understand, like, where do their choices make sense? If you look at the person's situation, if you really understand what the person is going through, yeah, the desire to die makes sense based in their lived reality, their phenomenological world, or their refusal to take medications, or they're not wanting to talk, or they're talking all the time, or they're living in some kind of very strange, difficult to connect with dream-like, fantasy-like world. And what is it in there that actually makes sense if you get inside of it? And how are the choices that they're making? How do those make sense? And then once you kind of can really relate to that, then you can start to understand, okay, this is why the person is making this choice. Are there other choices that the person might make? Even if it's the choice to stop thinking of yourself as a schizophrenic and start thinking yourself as a shaman, or the choice to just say there's nothing wrong with me, or the choice to say I'm going to continue to not want to take my medications until someone listens to me, and having that validated and having that honored and respected. There's a book, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was existentialist. And I think there's a lot of criticism of him. There's some questions or controversy about the book, but I think it's remarkable that he writes his story from being in the most disempowering circumstance of all, like being confined in a prison, in a camp. And yet still he was able to somehow find ways to create meaning and through exercising that power of choice. And then when I go further into that, I think about, well, that's really where drugging is so diabolical. That's where drugging and forced medication really starts to get into, in my view, evil, because you're infiltrating chemically someone's mind and you're interfering with their capacity to have choice. And I know that some people do feel that, okay, the drugs help me to have choice, or they help calm me down, or they help tame my extremes or my wildness. So I'm recognizing the diversity there. But there's something about the way in which psychiatry's authoritarianism and domination and control is especially extreme because of the way it infiltrates the mind and wants to take away even that last bit of freedom that someone might have if they're confined on the outside. At least on the inside, they have some freedom.
You just covered about 100 years of philosophy there. Yeah, I mean, wow, you covered so much. I think I focus more and more and more on agency. So the sense that, so many people have lost their sense of agency. So actually, they perhaps don't realize the choices that they have. And there's something incredibly liberating when you can empower someone to find those choices again. But your point, yeah, I mean, I didn't know there was controversy about Viktor Frankl. I mean, I've watched people's lives completely turn around because they've been waiting for someone to give them the meaning. And when they've been introduced to this idea of, well, actually, you can create your meaning and purpose yourself, I've watched them being literally liberated nearly in that moment. Um, but it's powerful because often people actually don't want their agency, because if you take full agency, then you're responsible. So there's a sort of tension in this area.
Responsibility, that's a controversial topic.
Yeah, it's a big area. And then when you get into coercion, that is, I cannot think of anything worse than someone invading your mind chemically against your will. And we know, well, I know that the world that R.D. Laing was trying to draw attention to back in the 50s and 60s, it hasn't gone away. It is very, very prevalent in hospitals and prisons. And so it goes on, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah, that question of responsibility, because choice, agency, it can be so twisted that you have responsibility now becomes it's your fault, becomes a blame the victim. You're choosing this yourself. It's your fault that you're in this circumstance. Take some responsibility is often an accusation that gets thrown at people, and it can be just another version of neglect or blaming the person or leaving the oppressor or leaving the oppressive system off the hook by saying, oh, you should just take responsibility. You can't take responsibility when what do you expect? I don't think that's actually what existentialism is doing. On the other side of it, yeah, if you want to make change, you do have to at some point accept the responsibility that goes along with having that agency and having those choices and deal with consequences of the choices that you make.
I think it's very nuanced. I think you're very on point to draw us to those areas, but I think existentialism is much more nuanced. I think for me, a choice can only be really made when you're really aware of what your choices are. For me, if someone chooses to do what someone else might feel is self abuse, if they do it with awareness, then that's a conscious choice. They've got agency. If they're doing it because they're acting out on their trauma and they just want to numb out their emotions and sort of kill off these overwhelming feelings, I think that's quite different. And I think it's sort of to nearly help create a clearing for people to see that actually they often have a little bit more choice and agency than they might initially think. Whether they decide to take that or not, that's up to them. I've never experienced anyone kicking back when someone is gently supported to find the clearing where they can see what choices are actually available to them and what choices they're kind of avoiding. And, a really nuanced area, and this is working with people who have been, significantly abused, particularly in childhood. So you're into the area of acceptance. And people often get acceptance very much confused with forgiveness. And this is a totally different area. You know, you do not have to forgive an abuser to accept. And people might be going, oh, what do you mean accept? Well, you can't undo. You know, a child cannot undo what has been done. They can't be given back what was taken, right? All they can do is respond to what has happened. And often, if people have lost their sense of agency, they might be consumed by anger or rage or just an inability to find the clearing. When they find their clearing, then they can see that there is an opportunity to go deeper into that and actually begin to grieve and mourn what was taken. And then after that, be able to move on. I think it's important to say I think of real quality therapy as art, very, very far removed from a medical model. It's a collaboration, it's a creation. So some of these terms and these existential terms can sound quite simple, but actually getting into that with someone very, very detailed, very, very nuanced, needs oodles of compassion and patience. And I use the term clearing, you know, helping someone find that clearing. When it comes to abuse, you know, that is a sensitive, consuming area. But I see people when they do find agency, things really can change. The abuse stops because the abuse doesn't stop after the actual physical abuse stops. It can go on and on and on in someone's life. So I think there's great value in the existential approach around agency and obviously supported by psychoanalytic thinking as well.
One thing I'm interested to hear more about is I know you're a really big proponent of open-heartedness, and it's like the opposite of scientific kind of cold. So, what does that mean to you, and how do you practice that?
So there's something about an encounter. You know, if you take a work of art, right, you go to the museum or the art gallery and you look at a work of art, there's something about this distance that you get to that painting, right? If you get too close, you kind of like fetishize. If you get too far away, it sort of gets too distant and too obscure. There's a sort of a sweet spot of that encounter with that work of art. And I think that open heartedness allows for an encounter, a meeting. You could think of the patient as a work of art, right? If you put labels and models and lingo and jargon, suddenly the open heartedness begins to close and a distance comes between you and that other person. So I think, you know, Lang talked about open heartedness to try and give words to how he encountered someone who had in those days labeled as paranoid schizophrenic, for example. You know, immediately that label can shut down people's open heartedness. And I make the distinction between open heartedness and open mindedness. Right? Open mindedness is pretty good, but open heartedness denotes an empathy and a connection. And also, it denotes that I am not afraid to encounter you. I am not afraid to look into the abyss with you. It is convenient to have labels and jargon, and the more things that you put in front of someone, the further away that you get. And the further away you get, the further away you get from people suffering, and that is convenient. So I think one of the areas, this is a bit technical, that I see that's very much missed in therapy is the fear of mourning, the fear of grieving. I often see therapists making, in fact, I've researched on this. I see therapists who desire to make someone comfortable, right? So they jump over the grieving of what is lost and what was taken, and they move into the move on.
It almost comes in with some of the trauma approaches where people are trying to be grounded and regulated and to not get overwhelmed, and which sound good until you realize that maybe that gets in the way of grieving and the way in which there is a kind of an uncontrollable just being hit by this giant wave of emotion that's part of what the grieving process I think always involves.
The model I would use is safety, seeking safety first. So instead of going into someone's past and history, I would want to help someone develop coping mechanisms to get day to day and week to week.
Mm.
And what happens is they learn how to cope, how to regulate, how to be grounded. And only then would I move into the area of grieving. So it's sometimes people can go into it too quickly, but really you're asking someone to have an encounter with deep grief, loss, and often depression, suicidal ideation. Why not? Because you're asking someone to lean into the pain that perhaps that they have avoided. So you can see the human tendency to fast forward that, to try and fix someone and to try and make someone feel better. So I think that also gets tied up into the system. People are looking for quick fixes. They're looking for the symptoms to be eradicated quickly and to move on.
Get back to work, get back to their roles, get back to taking care of the kids, back to school.
I think the stage is only missed. And, I experienced that in my own journey. Part of the reason why I also wanted to train in Western approaches was I didn't believe that Buddhism was often the right starting place for the average Western person. And this can be sort of supported by Sharon Salzberg in the early 90s asked the Dalai Lama what his views were on self hatred. And there was a bit of a kerfuffle, and people were wondering, is this a translation issue? He didn't understand the concept because it was a much more Western idea. The teachers, the Tibetan teachers in particular, learned that actually there was a lot more work to be done with a Western student to get them to a baseline. So the baseline would be feeling good enough for no reason, right? If you get to that point, you're still faced with the existentials of loss, death, old age, right? But you can face it with a good enough sense of self. A lot of people don't have a good enough sense of self. They've got a very fragmented, traumatized, split off sense of self.
So you've also studied open dialogue, and I want to ask you a little bit about what your experience is with that, because I think open dialogue kind of arrived in the United States with a lot of optimism and hope. And I think there's tremendous amounts of optimism and hope that open dialogue deserves, but the actual implementation of it can sometimes get lost or confused or thwarted by the institutional context that it's in without deeper, broader change. What are your thoughts about how open dialogue fits into this, and what's been your experience with it?
Yeah. So I was initially very excited. I felt great synergy with my own work, much less pathological approach, and also sitting uncertainty, not knowing, not implementing that knowing onto someone else. I have a few concerns. One is the sort of the training and the expense of the training and the length of the training and the dominance of the training in certain quarters. The other concern I had was it's as good as the people in the network. So I've had horrendous experiences where prescriber has been in the network and said horrendous things to a family. I've challenged what was said. I've challenged the senior management in that area and found that nothing changed. So I had to remove myself from the network because I didn't want to collude with how the person was treated.
And these are all people that are using the open dialogue approach,
Called.
called open dialogue. Yeah, yeah.
So, this idea of fidelity, how close is it to the original principles? I also have a concern that families, I do a lot of family work. So I do like a hybrid of open dialogue. And a lot of families come along having read the statistics in Finland. Oh, yeah, 79% of people, don't need medication and recover. So they've got an unrealistic expectation. And, it's not like for like. Finland had a sort of societal response. It was nested in a community that could support.
It's also a very different context for beginning therapy because in Finland, there's no system and then there's open dialogue. The open dialogue is the system in Western Finland and in Western Lapland, where it's so everyone is using that framework. Whereas in the US and other places, families or individuals have often been in the system for a long time. They've been disappointed, they've been harmed, they've been socialized into that. There's been all this damage that's been done. And then they hear about this vision or this idea of open dialogue, and they get this idea and then it's the idea that they're pursuing, and then they land with practitioners or an agency or something that's using an open dialogue. So it's a completely different scenario for how people are actually getting into the open dialogue setting. And then participants in open dialogue meetings have like studied open dialogue or read about it. So they're not just arriving as family members kind of naturally. They're sort of thinking about how do we do open dialogue? Because in Western Finland, I mean, because I trained in open dialogue, the patients, the clients, no one was trying to do open dialogue because it was this thing. It was just these are services and this is how we do things. And it's just a natural conversation that emerges out of it. So it's a very different context, I think. And there isn't enough studying and reflection about that. And what do you do about that? That maybe a lot of the promise, I think, of open dialogue is the early treatment, the fact that you're responding to what we would call first episode or first break, and you're dealing with the distress in the family, as it first emerges, because the culture there is that people, when they have problems, psychological problems, they contact Karaputis Hospital, and there's a relationship there, and there's kind of an early response. Whereas in the US, it's neglect, neglect, neglect. People go into the system, things get worse, they have these horrible experiences, and then they're searching for something, they exhaust the system, and then they hear about open dialogue, and now they show up at the door of an open dialogue trained clinician. So it's a very different context.
I think you make a really, really good point about, the families have read up about it, so actually it nearly interrupts what could be done. But the other thing I was sort of a bit shocked, concerned with is how are other people practicing? Because to me, open dialogue is the way I would communicate with somebody ordinarily, so it's the way I would think about someone. I don't know. I don't have the answer. So I'm going to remain open and I'm going to remain curious. What I would say is I sort of pivoted away from it in terms of fidelity. And I did a lot more work in the family with someone who often, as you say, they've been through they're traumatized by the system, actually.
Traumatized by the system, yeah, which is happening way less in the open dialogue context in Western Finland.
I saw incredible moments of healing in working with families. And I saw, because one of the concerns that I kind of had to move away from sort of child protection and stuff because I just saw abuse everywhere. So one of the concerns I had with open dialogue was, what if the abuser is part of the network, which is very common. So I struggled with that. But the families that I've worked with, I have seen healing, and I've seen healing when the trauma in the system is addressed.
Even just recognize, even just naming it and saying, yes, this was abusive. What happened to you in the system can be very relieving.
Absolutely. So I was with a family, I'd been worked for a long, long time. Yeah, I won't give you too much detail, but I'll just say that the work that we did, we made the connections with their trauma and their current behavior. And making those links, the behavior changed. But there was a moment when the father turned around and said, it was the biggest regret of my life bringing you to a doctor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's hard to talk about it without getting emotional.
Yeah. There's so many families like this. I have so many people come to me. The parents they've turned around because they trusted the system, they trusted the doctors over and over and over again. And now they have to wake up to, what did I do to my son? What did I do to my daughter?
The moment he said that, the son changed. It was like he was witnessed. It was like the universe just shifted, and the son never looked back. It was like a moment. It was that recognition, but it was the anxiety and the fear of being reinstitutionalized that was causing most of the problems. So when that was brought in, because when you think about it, it's not something you really want to talk about. People don't usually want to talk about what they're really afraid of, right?
Yeah. They're really afraid of it. Yeah. Fear is avoidance for sure.
So holding that space, so having all the knowledge of the traumatization in the system, so coming with that and then being able to give words to that, really, really powerful.
Which is really hard to do if you're embedded in the system that's doing the abuse, or you have some kind of like semi implementation of open dialogue where, well, we have the insurance companies, we have the doctors, we have the hospital system, and then there's this unwillingness to validate the abuse and to protect the person like so many families, there does have to be that agreement. We're not going to hospitalize you. Or there does have to be the agreement that, look, the father is in the room, the father is part of the network, but no, the father is emotionally abusive here. The father is, or it could be the mother, or it could be a sibling. And I think that's a real misunderstanding about open dialogue, that it's intending for the network to come together or intending for the family to meet together. I mean, yes, that can be very fruitful and that can be very useful because people are the relationships, but sometimes you don't want to be in the room with the abuser. Sometimes the safety is not there. And I think that the person who's facilitating or the therapist has to have the flexibility to create arrangements of meeting individually with someone, meeting separately with the parents, having another facilitator, another therapist that's working with other people in the family. Because if you're not paying attention to those basic issues of mistreatment, power, abuse, the harm that can be happening and that can be ongoing, if you're not paying attention to that, then yeah, you just become another part of the system enforcing the normalcy of violence. And I think it's a tremendous danger with open dialogue. I think when I was studying it, we did address it, but I can see how the implementation of it, people can just drift back into a lot of old assumptions or not have the skill or the clarity to kind of bring safety in. I mean, I've been in sessions where I will just stop the session, or I will ask one member of the meeting to leave, or I'll meet separately with someone because what's happening in the session is just reinforcing, is either harming somebody or it's just reinforcing something that's going on in terms of a power imbalance or some kind of abuse.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the abuser is the prescriber.
Absolutely.
I have been asked to head up an open dialogue service, and I said I couldn't do it because I didn't feel confident that I could collaborate with prescribers. I didn't feel there was any available who had the mindset that would really offer something that was different. And I think that's the danger. You know, people can talk the lingo of open dialogue, but do all the same things that they've always done. And that it didn't sit with me. I feel the best work I do is avoiding the prescriber and then advocating hard, particularly on polypharmacy.
Yeah. Yeah. If the prescriber is still using the same domineering, I know what's best, kind of fear-based, threatening, and has that power of forcing someone to the hospital. It doesn't matter how much open dialogue jargon there is. It just becomes the latest fad for the psychiatrist, the prescriber to feel good and sophisticated about what they're doing because they really do want to see themselves as helpers, as saviors, as protectors. And so they are going to grab a hold of something like open dialogue and say, yeah, I'm part of this too. I'm open dialogue as well, even when they're not actually being self-reflective. And then being able to challenge them and say, no, we don't want you here or go away. How do you do that when they have the power, when they have the prescription pad, when they have the power to lock somebody up, when you need them to get the dosages that you want? And also when they have so much influence towards other family members and the decisions that are being made. And the psychiatrist, the prescriber, really becomes sort of the master of fear in the context. Everyone's afraid, everyone feels guilty. And here's this authority figure that's seen as unafraid. Oh, I know what to do. Here's what you have to do. The confidence, the domination can play into, well, this is a solution to our fear because we can just trust the psychiatrist. And that plays out, I think, in open dialogue context as well.
Yeah, I think you put that beautifully. And, you know, earlier on, you made the point that for some people, medication can be helpful, right? You have that openness, right? I didn't find it worked the other way.
Right, right.
You know, where prescribers are open to the fact that sometimes it doesn't,
Exactly.
and sometimes it would be preferable not to medicate, right? So I didn't feel it was reciprocated unless you have that starting point. And there are people, I know that some of the people who do the training have partnerships with psychiatrists who really are signed up to it, right? But I personally just couldn't find one.
Yeah, they are out there. I think there's a lot of good open dialogue work happening, but you make a really good point. And also the idea of what's helpful is important to think about because taking a medication might be helpful if it means your mom and dad aren't going to kick you out of the house. You have nowhere else to go. So I think being very pragmatic But when I work with families, I always am thinking about, is the most vulnerable person alone or not? Do they have the advocate on their side? Do they have someone who's with them 100%? And I think it's a mistake to sacrifice that in the name of facilitating the whole family. Because if you're facilitating the whole family and one person has no voice, has no power, they're in danger of going to the hospital, they're being chemically restrained, they're at risk of further violence, their life is really on the line, then you're not on a level playing field. That person needs their voice supported first, and then maybe you can bring in these other relationships. But unless you have the skill and the awareness to actually support that one person who's vulnerable, then the power imbalance is just going to recreate all the different abuses of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it.
You're working within the system. I'm just curious how that works for you. Like, are you really drawn to work in those environments, or you feel like you can make a really big difference there, or you find places that you feel are a good fit for you, or?
Yes. So what interests me is offering the highest level of care to the people who are less likely to receive it. I am in a clinic where often people might get an intern. They're immediately surprised to get someone with three masters and a PhD. They intuitively know this is someone who has chosen to spend the time with them and not in a more lucrative private practice, for example.
You have three masters and a PhD? My goodness.
First of all, I didn't go to college until I was 34, and I always thought I was stupid because of the dyslexia, but it was because I kept moving. I mean, that's a whole other conversation about how licensing is so prohibitive. I had two masters and a PhD, and I still had to do another clinical master's to get a license in Massachusetts. It's just such bureaucracy.
Yeah, yeah. Then the student loan situation basically enslaves you to working for the system to just pay off the debts because you're under that financial pressure.
But I was lucky because mine was quite spread out because I moved. So, some in Malaysia, distant, some in London. But I feel that it's a calling for me. It's painful, to reading around, the things that you've said and some of the things that Nikki said to me before we came on. It's painful for me to think of people having bad experience in therapy, but I know what happens and it's very, very variable. I have spent the better part of my life studying, learning, being in therapy. I eat, breathe, sleep it. It's like absolutely dedicated to it. And when I see people who feel let down by therapists, it makes me very sad and very angry, but it is very, very variable. I think the difference in America compared to the UK, you had therapy as a standalone qualification. So people might have done a 5 year training. And within that 5 year training, they would have been in therapy themselves for the duration. So that doesn't guarantee a good therapist, but it guarantees someone's been working on their stuff and been challenged and they're nearly like molded. You, you don't start that journey unless you're really serious.
Well, sometimes I think there are licensing tracks for counselors and therapists, psychotherapists that don't need you to get any of your own personal therapy in the US context.
Majority, I think even somebody told me some of the licenses that did have it have taken it away. So I sometimes worry about psychologists more because they seem even more distant because they're talking like they have the knowledge, but actually often haven't had any personal experience of the therapy themselves. So I think good supervision. I mean, I've been at this for decades. I'm in supervision for 3 hours a week. I've got a supervisor in Canada, I've got one in the East Coast, and then I've got one in the clinic. That's not because I don't know what I'm doing. That's because you can never finish the learning, right? Because people are endlessly beautiful and complex. And I'll still be studying this art, I think, on my deathbed.
What about psychedelics, Michael? Is that an area that you're interested in, and are you using them?
Well, I've been very interested in speed at which it is kind of advancing in terms of therapeutic interest. There's obviously a connection with R.D. Laing. He was very much a man of the 60s and he very much did experiment with LSD and was very connected to the players in America at the time, Timothy Leary and Ramdas and Esalen. I don't feel comfortable working with a clinician who's working with people in extreme states who hasn't experienced an altered state themselves. So I would absolutely advocate it for someone. I remember being on an early intervention team in London and people were making pronouncements over what was or what wasn't a hallucination. And I asked, have any of you ever tried a psychedelic? And none of them had. And I said, well, what gives you the license to talk about hallucinations and that? The other thing I like about clinicians and psychedelics, not that I'm advocating for it, right? But one of the advantages is if someone takes, say, LSD, they're stuck in that trip. So the clinician gets an experience of maybe states that they're not comfortable with, but they have to stay with. And I think that gives a flavor of what it can be like for some people to be working with quite extreme states and kind of being locked into it. So I think Lang's idea that it does give people a flavor of an altered state that can eventually be useful clinically.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. The idea that psychedelics or experiencing any altered state could be useful for helpers, for clinicians. And definitely it's just a common sense, obvious thing. How do you sit with someone and talk about their experience when it's completely foreign to you? I mean, obviously, if you have something that you can connect it to with your own experience, ideally, we would have more people helping each other who've themselves been through so-called psychosis or so-called mental breakdowns. But I think that different altered states, maybe psychedelics could potentially create that empathy, especially having bad trips, because then people can maybe appreciate just the importance of a kind of spacious, calm, being with non-intrusive, non-judgmental. People can appreciate how sensitive you can be to the fears of people around you and the reactions to people around you. So I don't think there's a lot of push right now for that kind of use of psychedelics, like training the clinicians. It's very focused around psychedelics as mental health treatments, which I've written about before, and I think there's a huge, huge problems with that. But one of the things that's interesting about Lang and Kingsley Hall and the work that was done at Soteria House and Diabasis House was that the qualities of sitting with someone going through a psychotic state, so-called, being with that altered state, are the same qualities and skills of sitting with someone in a bad acid trip or a bad psychedelic trip. And even the work that's done in festivals now, if you read the manuals or you experience the different trip sitting approaches that are in festivals when people have a bad drug experience, you think, wow, this is actually, these are good guidelines for someone who's having an extreme state or having a manic crisis or whatever might get diagnosed as psychosis. So I think that the introduction of maybe familiarity with those states or relating to those states can be very positive for helpers.
I think so. Lang, when asked about, what was required in terms of training preparation, he said to experience LSD and to have read all of Freud. So when it comes to the jury's out for me, I would need it to know a lot more and a lot more research in terms of the benefit for the individual. And I get really irritated when someone tells one story of one person's experience and then that's meant to be. But what really interests me at the minute is ketamine and this whole idea of neuroplasticity. I think that is a fascinating area. But again, when the venture capital people are falling over themselves to get into it, then you sort of go, hang on a second, is this just going to be more medication? But I have been very impressed. I know that you've had some bad experiences, Will, but I've been very impressed with some of the people I've met in the ketamine world. And I thought they were really, really ethical and professional and knowledgeable. But again, it's as good as the person you meet.
It's an interesting question because I don't think it can be argued that some people are benefiting. Even before we start talking about treatments in clinical settings, people are using ketamine, they're using LSD, they're using MDMA in the underground, not just for partying. That's a misunderstanding. That's a war on drugs stereotype that psychedelics in the underground is always just for getting high and partying but for very serious spiritual and healing purposes. And so there's an undeniable, I think, history and reality that psychedelics can be very useful for people. But then the question to me is, what are the risks when you put it in a medical context? What happens to the people who don't have a good experience with ketamine and they maybe have a psychotic break and then maybe they're blamed, just like someone has a manic episode as a adverse effect of an antidepressant, then they're told they're bipolar. Someone goes into a ketamine clinic, they have a psychotic episode, and now they're said, "Oh, your bipolar has been uncovered, or you had a pre-existing condition of schizophrenia, and then we're just going to toss you into the hospital." And there's a way in which the kind of zealotry or the enthusiasm around psychedelics has prevented people from taking a step back and saying, look, these aren't for everybody. There are real risks. And when people do have extreme anxiety reactions, because I've talked with a number of people, there was a big thread online recently about people's negative experiences with ketamine. When they do have big anxiety experiences, or they do have dissociative experiences, or their depression gets worse, they get turned away. There's no holding, there's no support for them because they're not really on board with the program of the psychedelic as the solution. They become problems, they become burdens to the clinician. The clinician doesn't have any kind of infrastructure for supporting the person. They just sort of push them aside, which is kind of what psychiatry and psychotherapy have always done with the people that were the so-called problem cases or the difficult people who don't get better. So I think there's a lot of difficulty in bringing psychedelics into a medical context. At the same time, I don't think they should just be commercialized. We shouldn't just be able to, have the capitalist marketplace run amok on psychedelics, but we need some kind of middle ground where we're no longer going to be war on drugs towards people. Because relatively speaking, ketamine compared to alcohol or compared to tobacco, I mean, people need to be able to have access to choosing what they want to choose in terms of changing their consciousness or using it in any other way. But I wouldn't endorse like a full commercialization or a full medicalization. But we do need to step back from the war on drugs. But we need to do it in a way that's not going to just start romanticizing and promising miracle cures to people and downplaying the very serious risks that go along, not just from the drug itself, but from introducing a drug into that unbalanced power dynamic, which gives the potential for a huge amount of influence because these are suggestibility drugs, they're influence drugs, they're vulnerability drugs. So that isn't being addressed right now. Plus, a lot of the research that's giving a lot of miraculous kind of results, it's really skewed. The research is really designed and set up to have very much higher positive outcomes that I think we're going to actually see in the real world when things become more available.
I think there definitely is a romanticization and a rush, which is troubling. I have the same policy with all chemicals, and I think the biggest problem is a lack of respect. I don't think we respect alcohol. I don't think we respect cannabis. I don't think we respect ketamine for the powerful, potent substances that they are. I don't think psychiatrists respect the potency of the medication they prescribe. People can be prescribed a benzo like it's a tic tac. These are serious, potent drugs and they're not respected. I think if everyone respected drugs for the potency that they hold, a lot of the problems would definitely be reduced. And I think some of the psychedelic experiences were conducted in a more ritualistic way. And that had a lot more awareness and compassion and foresight than the McDonald's I see. I mean, it really is a McDonald's that you can go online and, access ketamine like it's a happy meal. So I think you make great points. I think has to be some sort of middle ground, and I don't think we've quite found it yet. The reason I find ketamine interesting is because it's obviously a lot shorter. You take a trip of acid, you can be locked in. It's not for the faint-hearted. It can be extremely dangerous. Ketamine has its risks, but it's a much shorter, people can go into a trip 30 minutes and they're out again.
Yeah, it depends on the route of administration and then also the dosage.
I see a lot of people abusing these drugs. I see people in the local area where I am abusing DMT, right? I know people who have had torturous experiences that have lasted an eternity.
Yeah, well, this brings back to the whole question of why are we providing individualized treatments when the whole society is really the problem? I mean, the problem for me with psychotherapy conversations is that it's all about like the individual. In fact, I think what's driving distress in society is the community breakdown. It's the way in which capitalism is kind of feeding and digesting and transforming everything. So we're just these isolated consumers. So I think that's a big part of the danger of psychedelics is that you just introduce psychedelics as another consumption item in an isolated virtual reality that we're moving towards. And so you raise a really important point around the ritualistic aspect. I mean, a lot of the ayahuasca experience that's appealing to people is that you're kind of joining a church and you're joining a community and you have the singing and you get gathered together and you do like a sleepover together and you develop this network of connections and you have this focus and you're sharing stories. And that's really the revitalization I'd love to see. And I don't know if you've ever tried breath work, but I think it might be really interesting for you and for anybody.
I have.
You have. Okay. Well, you did it at Esalen, I think you did actually.
It was a life affirming, changing experience because I went in as a skeptic.
This was your Esalen breath work that we did together.
Yeah, so someone told me in the hot tub, oh, it's like taking 4 hits of ayahuasca, and I just laughed. I said, "This is the most ridiculous thing." And I went along. I didn't want to feel out of step with the rest of the participants, so I thought if I didn't go, they would have some sort of experience that I didn't. And I went in, and I mean, it connected me with the holotropic, and it connected me with a range of things that I would never have ordinarily considered. And I think it made me a better therapist.
From one breathwork session.
I could tell you what happened. You kidding?
Please tell us what happened. Yeah, tell us what happened.
Oh, do you really want me to tell you what happened?
Yes, yeah.
So I had no idea really what to expect, and I was with a friend who I knew a little bit. So when the session started, I experienced them as being more concerned about themselves than me, and it manifested in them putting their hand on my shoulder. And as soon as the music started, about 5 minutes in, I had this experience of being surrounded by rain, like in a circle. And when they put their hand on me, I had an experience of being pushed into the earth and experiencing the energy of the indigenous people. And I could just go on and on and on, but it didn't end there. It went on for months. It connected me with something that kind of was beyond words, but it really had a theme of tuning into something much more earth. And I know that you made comments about Estlin and you were very mindful of the sacred space that we were on, but it was quite incredible. But I came away really connecting with this idea of a healer. And believe it or not, I'd never seen myself in that way. And when I arrived at Estlin, I felt a bit burnt out. And I had this sense of a communication to say, now you're being initiated and you need to go back out. It was very, very powerful indeed.
Beautiful. Yeah, I remember I was assisting that breathwork session because I do that work at Esalen, but I didn't have a chance to hear more about your experience. That's amazing. And it continued and you carried it with you after.
Absolutely. And it prompted me to do a lot of reading and understanding about the experience.
Part of the reason I brought it up is because the central aspect of breathwork sessions is the creation of that community space. And it's very ritualized and it uses music. And you can think, okay, this is kind of theatrical, it's kind of new agey, but experience it because it's powerful. It has roots in our psyche and the way that we come together and the way that we create vulnerability with each other and that suggestibility that happens just from breathing in this elevated way that creates a natural altered state, but it's very mild, it's very subtle, you're in control of it. But it shows that we often give drugs too much power, that psychedelics are really just kind of tapping this suggestibility, this openness, this capacity that we have within ourselves that we kind of don't necessarily even need the substance to access if we have the right kind of community ritualized sort of placebo setting. And that's why I think it's really powerful for people who are interested in psychedelics to maybe try with someone that they trust, try a breathwork session to get a taste of what that can possibly be, because a lot of people are skeptical. Oh, how could it be as powerful? And then you have this incredible, strong, emotional, shifting, visionary experience just from breathing and listening to music.
I would never have believed it until I experienced it. But I want to say something I think really important. I do value community. So I run a lot of groups where I create community, and some of the groups call themselves the trauma tribe, right? So it's reappropriating this idea of trauma as a positive. And there is immense healing in those spaces that come from community and also from laughter. I have groups where every single person has been horrifically sexually abused as a child, and there's laughter in those groups. And I think there's agency and freedom in that you can hold both. You can hold the trauma, but you can hold that we are in community and we're encountering each other. So I absolutely agree. But I would say it is also possible to create deep and meaningful community within therapeutic spaces if you know what you're doing. If you're open hearted and you have a really good Irish sense of humor.
Well, we've got both present here in abundance.
Michael, we're about out of time. Can you tell listeners how to get in touch with you?
Sure, you can check out my website, which is mrmtherapy.com, or you can email me on michael@mrm. That's Michael Robert Montgomery, mrmtherapy.com.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So yeah, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining, Michael. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor and a privilege. I think we were only starting to get warmed up.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to have you back on the show.
When my book comes out, I'll be back.
What is your book going to be about?
My book is my life's work, and it is called Psychophobia.
Which is Lang's term for people being afraid of going inside and expressing and feeling and experiencing and talking about and sharing. Is that what it means?
Yeah, I see a major, major problem in people being afraid of others' minds and also their own. And therefore, they treat people differently. I'll tell you a quick story before I finish. I remember in my early days, I was an outpatient clinician. And it was my first day in this community setting. And I walked into the reception and I saw, because I'm hyper vigilant, right? As a good therapist should be, I saw a couple of people's sort of shoulders tighten up. And when I said I was a new clinician starting, they relaxed. And I immediately thought that is how they respond to someone that they think has got mental health issues. Even the people who are meant to be in the caring are seeing that person differently. So I see it as a huge problem. I see psychiatrists are psychophobic. They medicate discomfort, they medicate suffering, they won't be with it. I also see people who are also afraid of their own minds. And a great fear for people who have had an interface with the system is going back there or slipping back there. And I think true agency is really knowing one's mind. So you're not afraid of it anymore. That's the whole area of psychophobia that I hope to really get into. But I hope it's going to be a popular book that addresses some of this and sort of makes a difference for people who are traumatized by how they're treated by others.
Well, Michael Montgomery, thank you for joining us on Madness Radio.
Fantastic. Hope to see you again soon.
And Nikki Glasser, thanks so much for joining and co-hosting and co-producing the show today.
Good to be here. You've been listening to an interview with Michael Montgomery. He is an existential psychoanalyst working in a clinic specializing in psychosis and complex trauma. He works in the tradition of R.D. Laing using a non-pathologizing approach. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. See you next time.
What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.